Sarah.
Melissa.
What are we doing today?
We're looking forward and we're looking back from all fours.
Sarah, here we are in the early days of 2025. I have to say, when I have to write the date for things, I feel like I'm writing like a futuristic date of an imaginary time that hasn't happened yet, but it truly is the year 2025. Does that blow your mind?
It really does. Yeah, there's something about that 25, especially since I graduated high school in 2000. It does definitely put some things in perspectives in terms of aging and where we are in the world.
A quarter of a century has passed since you graduated from high school.
Yeah, that feels really good.
But that's how much wiser you are. You are a generation's wiser since graduating.
One would hope. I don't know.
Do you think that you accomplished, or at least near accomplished, a lot of your goals, some of your goals in terms of reading in 2024?
That's important. An important distinction.
Let's not get too personal on the podcast. But your reading goals for last year, you wanted to recap what they were and then sort of update us on how they went?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I really set out with a specific number goal in terms of what I was going to read. And I will say, like mid-year, like in the middle of the summer, like I had hit a little bit of a lull, which we had talked about on one of our previous episodes. But I feel good about what I read. I ended up reading about like 31 books total for 2024, which was more certainly than I think I had read maybe 22 books in 2023. And I feel focused on, what I kind of want to do for 2025.
I'm all about not quantifying the goals. Like I made my little chart for like the covers of the books that I read throughout 2024. And that was a little bit of a vanity project for me, not going to lie, to be like, hey, I had a good volume of reading there. But I mean, if you want to get really sticky about it, like some of those were novellas, some were graphic novels, and all are valid. I have I'm not trying to make a case for like one is more authentic or more real or better than the others. But, you can frame whether or not you achieved a goal pretty easily, right? Like if you say, I want to read 10 books and then you read 10 novellas and still call it 10 books, like there's a certain amount of like manufacturing to make sure that you like achieve the goals. So I was like super pleased with my reading in so much as I got a lot of reading done, but I felt like it didn't overtake me. I was listening to a podcast, one that I really like. I've talked about it on here before, the Books Unbound podcast. And, they're like crazy avid readers. And one of the hosts was like, this was last year. She was like, one of my goals for 2024 is to not read as much. She's like, I feel like I read so much that I'm sometimes not present in my own life, or I'll forego things that could be valuable to me in other ways to read. And she wanted to like reduce her reading. And I was like, that's very refreshing.
It's about quality over quantity, right? Like you want the reading that you're doing to be something that you feel good about and that brings you something, and not just reading for the sake of reading and just, so you can put another notch in your reading bedpost, as it were.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. And we talked about it last year. And this is something that I think, I'll speak for myself, but I think it's true for both of us, that one of the things we wanted to do was read in a way that brought us into conversation with others. And I really felt like we accomplished that. Reading things that were current helped us sort of connect with other people who were reading current things. But then like the reading challenge and just like taking recommendations for more people or offering more recommendations to people, I really feel like it was a force for connectivity as opposed to isolation.
And I mean, we love talking about books. Like, so, I mean, that's the whole point of all of this, is that shared experience, even if you haven't necessarily read the same book, but that you can have a conversation with a book and about a book.
Yeah. And so now looking forward to 2025, What would you say, Sarah, are the goals that you would like to incorporate into your reading for 2025?
I did join Goodreads. I had a lot of people who I had encountered in discussions about the podcast say like, are you on Goodreads? And I'm like, no, I'm not. And I had been using like a Google document to like list anything that I had read or anything I was interested in reading, but it wasn't a perfect science, to the point where when we were looking at our 2024 titles that we had each read and making those little posts for our social media, I had left a book off. I know. So I was like, you know what? Maybe Goodreads will be good because it might be like a little bit of a better tool for me to use to track what I've read and to get recommendations. In fact, I feel kind of proud about this. I mean, again, it's not a numbers game, but here we are. We are not even in mid-January, and I'm on my third book of 2025, which is pretty good. And 2 of the titles were recommendations from Goodreads based on books that I already had read or had interest in. And so I ended up getting those books and have enjoyed them so far. So I think tracking better is a goal of mine. And also, I don't want to hit a lull this year. And it's okay if you do hit reading lulls. Like I want to maintain like a better flow of reading for the year. So I think that's my ultimate goal, is to enjoy what I'm reading, understanding that I'm not going to love every single book that I'm going to read, but that I hope that I don't take myself out by reading a real dud and maybe have a DNF. I'm loath to do that. I want to, when I read a book, I want to commit to reading it and actually complete it. I did have a bunch of DNFs last year, but I want to be more comfortable with that and embrace it more. Like I feel shame about my DNFs from 2024.
And I'm here gasping because I feel like I am like your reading confidant. I'm part of this journey with you, and that I have not heard of these DNFs. These were not disclosed to me.
So there was a Philip Roth that I had started, and I mean, I don't even know if you could even call it a DNF because it was like a DNS because I had read like literally 2 pages and I just was like, wasn't in the mood for reading. It wasn't even that particular book. And then it was due back at the library and I was like, well,
that decision's made for me.
Yeah. So there were some books like that that were DNFs, but
one of my reading goals for this year is actually to not spend as much money on books. Speaking from, the Canadian standpoint, and we're going to talk a lot about All Fours. All Fours was a $40 book when I purchased it this summer. That is a lot of money for a single book. Like if you are buying a new hardcover book, if you want to be part of a current conversation and you are reading only one new hardcover book per month, you're pretty close on $500 for books in one calendar year. And I'm all about supporting authors, booksellers, but that's a steep price. It does kind of make reading a little bit elitist, a little bit inaccessible. And so one of my goals for this year is to try to continue reading things that are current and still trendy, part of a contemporary conversation, but not to fork over, I'm sure I spent over $500. Now I will just say, when it comes to the kids, and they know this and they exploit this, we never say no to a book. Like if they want to buy a book, it's a yes, like 10 out of 10 times. So we will continue in that practice for them. But I want to just kind of explore different ways to access literature, not just books, but access literature in ways that are not super hard on the old pocketbook in this economy. But it's funny because you mentioned about the flow of reading, and I was thinking about how I'm going to have to be kind of more organized, especially with my library usage, because a lot of books are going to require me to like put holds on things and order things in from other library sites. And I don't know about you, but I love having something in the hopper, right? That it's
Me
like,
too.
as soon as I'm done this one. So if I have like a real reading binge on a Saturday and I'm ready to start something new on Sunday, I don't want any downtime. So I feel like I need to kind of keep that flow, keep organized. I have a couple of ideas for how I'm going to do it, but using the library, using like more lending systems, even informally, like with friends and that sort of thing. I think I need to set myself like an actual budget. Like I think I need to say $250 for the whole year and see if I can do it. initially, one of the things I thought about, and I would encourage anyone who's listening and might be thinking about taking on a similar goal for 2025 and who lives in an environment where this is possible, one of the things I wanted to do was say, okay, this will be my budget, $250 for the year. And that I was going to say, and all of it will be spent in my local economy. But really, I'm looking at one chain store. That's all I really have as a book retailer. So I'm thinking, even if I can just support like Atlantic authors or Newfoundland publishers or something, to try to make sure that that spending is still supporting the economy around writing and books in my region. But it would be probably impossible for me to get books that I want to read and still support a local bookseller, which made me so sad to vocalize when I realized it.
Yeah. One of the things that you also had mentioned was this idea of, utilizing like kind of your community of readers, right? And I think a way to kind of stretch your dollar, but also be able to have access to different books, is putting it out there to friends and colleagues who may have spent the $40 on the new title, and you borrow it from them, and maybe you have something that they haven't read and they haven't purchased. And so I think that's another really great way to be able to ensure that you're keeping current. And then it also then opens up the potential for great conversation, because now you have a shared read with somebody.
Totally. I was like, there's a certain amount of strategy that needs to go into this, because if you're looking to someone to borrow their bestseller, really hit book, and you're like, would you like to borrow my copy of Mice and Men? Like you have to have something in that it's going to act as like currency there, So one book that I do think I have in my arsenal, sorry, I always laugh when I say arsenal, but one book I do have that I think will be a good one in that economy is, of course, drum roll please, the $40 hardcover copy of Miranda July's All Fours, which I finished reading last week. You read this well before me and waited with bated breath for me to be able to talk about it with you. So I'm going to let you kind of like take the lead here. Do you want to give a summary of this one, or would you like me to?
I can certainly take a stab at giving a summary, but yes. So All Fours by Miranda July is an exploration, I would say, of what it is to be a woman and what it is to be an artist and what it is to be going through changes in your life. What those transformations look like. The book is about an unnamed character, but she's a woman and she's an artist, and she does resemble July herself without actually being her. And she goes on a journey. She's supposed to be going on a cross-country trip from Los Angeles, California to New York City by herself, as kind of like a challenge to herself that she can do this on her own, because it's not something that she's really comfortable with. But about 30 minutes outside of her own town, she ends up making an unexpected stop and makes eye contact with a young, handsome Hertz employee and makes a really interesting decision to hunker down in this little town for the entire 3 weeks that her road trip was supposed to take. She really goes on a journey in a hotel room with herself and with this young man. And it opens up a lot of things for her that she subsequently, after, this experience is over, has to kind of reconcile who she is as a woman, what it means to be someone who is in the perimenopause, what that means for her physically, what that means for her sexually and emotionally, and what it is to be truly honest with yourself and to live authentically. And so that is my attempt at a synopsis.
That was a beautiful synopsis. I was like, I got to read this all over again. No, it's definitely interesting how much I feel like the first part of the book is so critical in terms of communicating to people what this book is about. Because even though it goes well into, the book actually spans, I think, 3.5 years or something. Yeah. But that kind of like false start, but that ultimately ends up sort of like jumpstarting the rest of the story, and conceivably the rest of her life, is so different from what you're expecting in the book, and so different from what has been presented, that even without getting into all the details of what happens in the sort of latter portion of the book, it's really important to emphasize that first piece where you go, wait a minute, what? She's not going to drive across the country? Like, you are so ready for a road trip book. That doesn't happen.
No.
I have kind of conflicting feelings about this narrator character. How did you feel about her? Did she feel like someone you would be friends with? Did you have immediate respect for her? Did you have immediate disdain for her? Like, what was some of your relationship with her as a character?
I will say my own personal feelings about her. We'll start there, but then what I can understand others might feel about her. I liked her. I found her very funny. Like I related to her, like some of her observations, some of her quips that she would make, because everything is really internal. This is a very internal book. You're really inside her mind and what she's experiencing and going through. I did like her. However, there is a however there. She comes from such a place of privilege that some of the things that she's struggling with, and they are legitimate things, and I think in a wider context, universal things that she struggles with in terms of this idea of identity and aging and desire and fantasy. I think some of those things are truly universal, but the way that she gets to explore those things within herself and her own life is so privileged because she is wealthy. She is an artist. She does not have a 9-to-5 job. Even this idea that she's taking this like 3-week road trip to New York City. And yeah, it was some, I think it was like a whiskey commercial or something. And they used a line of text and she got a big paycheck from it. And this is what's allowing her to go on this like indulgent, and she would even admit indulgent trip. And even what she ends up doing with that money is super indulgent. And I could see very easily how someone would be very put off by that. There's a best friend in the book named Jordy. And I mean, what a saint Jordy is, and what a truly good friend Jordy is to the narrator, because, you know, some of the stuff that she gets on with would be really trying in a friendship.
Yeah. And I kind of read Jordy a little bit as just like, kind of a tool for the author. Not that Jordy was not a tool. But like having Jordy there was very valuable in terms of constructing the book. Like I think certain portions that might have taken longer to convey to the reader, or you kind of have Jordy inserted there so that she can offload a bunch of information, get a bit of feedback, and then the story can move on. So I did, like you said, I did kind of struggle with this idea of this very decadent person who, you know, everything is her work. So she can say she works all the time, but that work involves like going to the gym or hanging out in her garage or watching a lot of YouTube. And yeah, there was no sort of urgency for making money. It seemed like there was more urgency for spending money, which could not relate to. But sometimes I pan out when I feel that way. And I'm just like, I like a lot of content that I don't relate to. Like, I'm not a huge Bridgerton fan. I know a lot of people love Bridgerton. I don't know a lot of people who live in the Victorian era and have titles. You know, like you don't have to only like stuff that you can 100% relate to. So I just would kind of remind myself of that and then just keep rolling through the story, because to go back to even the construction of the story, I loved how linear this story was. Like, I feel like we're always talking about books, and part of the reason it's hard to give the synopsis is because it's like, well, and then there's another character, but that was 40 years before. And then, you know, we're oscillating between the viewpoints of 14 sets of quintuplets who all have a different experience with their futuristic, like there was none of that. It was very in the now of the book. And the now of the book moved in a way that was chronological. So I really actually just liked that you were just kind of plug and play, like, let's go and let's see where this leads us. And through that 3-year period, which I didn't realize until I neared the end of the book. And it was because I had noticed maturation in the child's voice. Sam suddenly seemed older. And I was like, whoa, what's going on here? That's not how that kid would speak. And then I realized sort of through that, oh yeah, because years and years have passed.
I failed to mention that the narrator is married and has a child. And I believe the child, Sam, is, I don't know, maybe like 5 or 6.
Sam is 10. Yeah, 10 at the end.
Yeah.
So 7 to 10.
It's divided into parts too. And I think that those parts have their own shape to them. So, you know, you have your part that's set at this hotel, or it's motel, really. I mean, and it's a dingy one. And so one of the things that she does with her money is she redecorates this motel room that she's in. She spends a boatload of money making it like this perfect, beautiful, elegant room that is completely outside of what the setting would normally allow. I wanted to know, like, okay, well, what happens next? Because like you said, you're expecting her to go on this road trip and what's going to happen. And she doesn't go on the road trip. And then she stays and she encounters this younger man, because she herself, I think at the time of the book, when it begins, I think she's 46, I believe. And he is in his, late 20s, maybe.
Yeah.
And so you think that this is gonna go in a certain direction, and it does kind of go in that direction, but in a way that you will not have expected it to go. And the encounters that they have are not what you would necessarily expect that they would have. But I found it so riveting, personally.
So obviously I came to this book by way of your recommendation, but other friends.
And I hadn't even really read it. I think when
Right.
I challenged you, I knew I was getting it, or I had purchased it and was
Yeah.
gonna read it. And then I was like, hey, let's both read this, because it's
Yeah.
supposed to be like a wild ride. So let's go on it together.
And that's the thing. Like, there were lots of reviews popping up about it as well. And then, of course, people that we know started reading it. And I felt like everyone was kind of guarded. They were like, you have to read it. But I'm
not going to say anything.
Yeah, it was like this whole, like, you got to find out for yourself. You have to, you have to get there. You have to experience it for yourself. I took this book on the boat. I was going to read it. We have like a little cabin that we were going from Newfoundland to Nova Scotia. And I sent the picture to Shanda, and I was like, oh, this is what I'm going to be reading for the next 6 hours on the boat. And she was like, you can't read that book around your children. And I was like, what is going to happen in this book? So I think my expectations were kind of skewed. And then I think I ended up sending both you and Shanda what did ultimately happen on the boat, which was that Tom read the whole thing.
So he read the whole thing. I saw the picture of him reading it. Wow, he read the whole thing. That's great. I mean, I knew he read it, but I wasn't sure how far he got. Yeah.
I actually was like tempted. I'm like, we need to get Tom in here as like a bit of a male perspective consultant on this, because he read it in like less than 2 days. Like, he just plowed through it. He really enjoyed it. But obviously we kind of zeroed in on different sections, right? And so he and I have had some like pretty interesting conversations about the book. But just to circle back to why I actually started down this tangent, as I tend to do, was because I did not know what to expect at all, because everyone kept sort of saying, like, find out for yourself, don't read it around your kids. And people were categorizing it as smut, which I really resist. Having read the book, I think that is really shallow.
Yeah, I agree.
would not give it that categorization at all. But I will say that the sexual encounters of the book were nothing what I anticipated.
There's one in particular, an encounter between the narrator and Davy, who is the name of the young man that she has this, really, I guess it's an emotional affair, because there's some intense feelings there. But yeah, there's this encounter between the two of them in a bathroom, is I guess I'll say, so that you, Melissa, will know exactly what I'm talking about. That I was like, wow, okay, but I got it. I can actually see this. Yeah.
And I feel like that particular encounter, like, if anyone were to question, like, is this Miranda July and all she's cracked up to be? That scene does it for me. Like, yes, she is. She's very smart. She's very creative. And she is bringing readers to places where mentally they had not explored before. And this is to my point earlier of why I think categorizing it as smut, I think, is such a disservice. Because it's not. That's not what that was about. That wasn't salacious sexual scenes. That was like really getting at something kind of powerful and profound.
Intimacy. True intimacy.
Because I think this was in something that you sent me about this book, but I think she resists the term emotional affair. I can't remember the exact specificity of it, but the idea that there's so many versions of intimacy, and one shouldn't be prioritized over the other.
And connection, and I mean, she goes through a lot of explorations and conversations with different people and their interpretations of what it is to be in long-term relationships, and what fidelity looks like or infidelity looks like, and is infidelity even really a thing? And we're humans and we have impulses and desires, and so yeah, I could totally see why she would maybe resist that categorization of emotional affair. There is one thing I want to read. This is a scene earlier on. So it's on page 70. So earlier on in the book. And she's just kind of holed up in this motel. And she's starting to just go on these walks, these evening walks with this young man, Davy. Nothing has happened between them. But this point, I remember stopping when I read it. And I was like laughing, but also like, oh yeah, this right here. And I will start the quote here. We'd hiked up into the hills again, chit-chatting the whole time about air travel, then TV shows and funerals. We stopped to look at the view and catch our breaths, and he took his sweater off. And as he pulled it over his head, his t-shirt lifted too. And in front of me was his chest. I don't want to describe it. I'll just say that there were only a few hairs around his nipples. That's all I want to say at this juncture. Skinny, but muscles. That's all. Enough. The word ripped comes to mind. The end. I was alone with it because for a moment his head was covered by his lifted sweater and he was busy getting untangled. He wasn't very or unusually tangled. This wasn't a kitten hopelessly tangled in a ball of yarn. No, this was an ordinary brief moment of covered face. For a few seconds, I was alone with his chest, his nipples, the hairs, and it was a hollowed moment. The urge to kiss his chest was very strong, but somehow this felt understandable. Like if you were in a similar situation, sorry, like if you were in a similar situation with Jesus, if Jesus had his sweater over his head and you were suddenly facing his chest, well, you would kiss it. You would not miss the chance for the whole rest of your life to be blessed by the experience. Then he pulled the t-shirt down and I quickly turned my head toward the view and he tied his sweater around the waist and glugged some water and we started walking again. For the rest of the walk, I looked down or away. This is like, I felt like that's such an encapsulation of her humor. I love that she's like, I'm not going to say much about this. And then she just goes on and on. And I just felt like that's such a great way to capture like this sense of overwhelming desire. And that like a split second can contain multitudes.
It's an almost religious experience.
If Jesus were walking and he would take his sweater off, you would want to kiss his chest too.
Yeah. It is a perfect encapsulation of her voice too, of the type of humor, of the type of person. Yeah. But yeah, that's so her. Everything in there, is sort of indicative of like what that voice is like. Was there ever a point that you thought, oh, Davy's a con artist? I don't want to say that and suggest that no young man could feel attracted by an older woman. I just at certain points read that character and wondered, did this come from a place of less desire than how she was coming at the situation?
I think he had desire for her. I think he had feelings for her for sure, to the same level that she did. Maybe not. I don't know how much more easily he was able to slip back into his life once she exited his. Versus, I mean, she had a really harrowing emotionally experience having to go back into her own life. I mean, she left this space that she had created, this world that she had created for these 3 weeks, and then had to go back into her regular life and then operate as if everything was fine. And everything wasn't fine for her. She was struggling greatly. But was it as hard for him as it was for her?
Right. So if we think about her more serious relationships that are mentioned in the book, obviously her experiences with Davy, her experiences with her husband, Harris, but also her relationship with Chris. I would argue that in the relationship with Chris, she's definitely the one who is more invested, more sort of exuberant in that relationship. And Chris does also kind of taper off at the end, and she questions, did this mean as much to Chris as it meant to me? So I do wonder, like, if we're trying to be shown something about the narrator's approach to relationships. And I find it really interesting because Harris to me is like just super normal, likable, very sort of straight and narrow, possibly even conservative, certainly by way of like the communities in which they live in California. But I cannot picture them as a couple. Like, I find it really, they seem so mismatched in terms of her other objects of desire. I don't know if you had the same reaction.
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, I think that's an important point in the book, is that he is so quote unquote, normal. And I think that that is such a huge barrier and what ultimately has such an impact on their relationship, because she cannot show her full self to him. Like, it's there even in the beginning. You know, they're at a party and she's dancing and he looks over at her and she can see like a look on his face like, oh, you're going a little too overboard with this dancing. But then he does this salute, which is like a thing that they do to one another. It was like the thing that they did when they first met. It's a way of them, I guess, recognizing each other and showing that they're like on the same team. But, you know, I feel like even in that same section, you know, she's talking about when they first met and how she told him about her background and how she used to work at a peep show. And she could see his face like falling. And then she like really tried to reframe it. And she was like, oh, that was just like a youthful indiscretion and not who I am at all now, even though it is still who she is. And even her encounters, her sexual encounters with Harris, like are forced. When she's talking to Jordy about it, she talks about how she looks at it as like a chore, as like exercise, like something she has to get out of the way. So although she's the one in the relationship that initiates sex, she does it just to get ahead of it. And that's the way that's even the phrase that she uses, it to get ahead of it. And then in order for her to actually be engaged in the act, she's fantasizing all of these kind of like questionable scenarios in order for her to get to the level of arousal that's going to make her be in it and to get something out of it.
She thought about Harris's dick as a boiling kettle, and that like she could hear the whistling. Have you got it?
I have it right here. So this is her conversation with Jordy, and she says, sometimes I could hear Harris's dick whistling impatiently like a tea kettle at higher and higher pitches until I finally couldn't take it, and so I initiated. I just feel like it is amazing that she met Harris when she was 30 and that she just was like, I gotta settle down. And he was a great person for her to do that with. He was a great person for her to settle down with and to have a child with, but then she does it. But then I think she realizes like, oh, but that's actually not fully who I am. And I don't know that I can be fully who I am with this particular partner.
And I think that the author demonstrates that she never fully commits to the relationship or commits to the self that she becomes in this relationship is probably the better way of phrasing it. I think she is committed, it's certainly in the early stages, by talking about the fact that he had a ready-made home that she moved into. Yes. And she only ever purchased 12 spoons to go with it. That there was no furniture, that there was no amount of decorating or influence that she kind of put on that space. And I thought that was really interesting about it seeming like she was in a place temporarily. If you think about some of the ways that her whole life is described, it's these blocks of time, these units of time. And even this book in itself is a unit of time, right? This 3.5 years of self-discovery. There was the time before, there was the time after. And it's very clear too that Harris, you know, he was a bit older. He had a whole life before he met her. She plugs into that life and then she's going to plug out. This is an 18 to 25 year span of them raising Sam. And then they were in other places before and they'll be in other places after. So I thought it was an interesting way to kind of show this alternative kind of understanding of relationships, of raising children, of being partners in that process too.
Yeah, definitely. And there was, I think it was a NPR Fresh Air interview that I had listened to with her, with Miranda July, and talking about this book. And the interviewer was asking her about her own experiences, because I think the interviewer really wanted her to like say like, yeah, that's me, this is me in the book. But I know that, like, you know, one of the things that this interview on NPR, you know, she was talking about what was the experience like in her own real life with breaking up with her husband and then co-parenting a child. And, you know, she had some really interesting things to say. And one of them was kind of essentially like, you know, one of the things that allowed them to do was to just actually get to like just enjoy each other as people, because they weren't in a relationship anymore. They could actually just like rediscover the things that they actually kind of just liked about each other as friends. And so I thought that was kind of interesting and lends itself to some of the things that she's trying to explore in the book.
You and I both came to this book as people in their 40s. That's right.
Yeah, that's right. Now you are.
If I had said this a little over a month ago, I would have been in my late 30s coming to the book, which would have just been completely different. How does this book speak to you as a woman in your 40s?
Oh my God. Has it ever resonated? Like, I really feel like some of the things that she's expressing, especially some of the, I guess, anxiety that she's expressing about this period of time in your life as a woman in your 40s, and the idea of perimenopause and menopause and what that means for you physically, what it means for you emotionally, this transformation that takes place that you have no full control over to a degree. That really spoke to me because I feel like, medically, I think women's bodies are understudied, have historically been understudied. But I think this experience has also not really been written about, not in such like a in your face, honest way. So for me, I thought it was refreshing to see. I thought it was encouraging that there could be a dialogue that could develop from a book like this, and that it makes you feel a little less crazy if maybe you're feeling some similar things that maybe this character is going through in the book. How about you?
There was a point in the book, and I think you'll probably remember this part because she includes a chart.
She does.
That sort of shows the steep drop off of estrogen in women at age 46-ish.
I've got it right here. Yeah.
But I definitely took that as on your 46th birthday. Like I was like, oh my God.
Oh my God. I've got
the inclusion of the graph was a very smart choice because it was so poignant and it was so stark. No matter how many times an author can narrate or have their narrator say like, and a very steep line, like, no, I needed to see it. I needed to see it in relation to the male testosterone level, which is pretty stable, especially with this like dropping point of estrogen. So when I got to that point, and I have just had my 40th birthday, like less than a month, I was like, oh boy, I am in the final, I'm at the finish line here. This is almost a done deal. Like it was a little bit like, I'm not going to say overwhelming, but it packed a punch for me to be like, this is, I'm nearing the end of something. And then what awaits me after it? And so I felt really kind of like upset. I definitely took a photo of it and sent it to a friend and was like, can you believe this bullshit? But then she does this process. I think she calls it open sourcing or crowdsourcing, open sourcing,
I think,
of like other women that she knows who've gone through it. And I actually found that really inspiring because I was like, I don't want to feel this depressed about like losing it sort of thing. Like I wanted to be able to see life beyond menopause or perimenopause and still kind of be positive about my femininity and my womanhood.
There were some women that were expressing like, the hormonal changes that are like so up and down throughout the course of your cycle as a woman who's in like childbearing years, how that kind of evens out. And that some of the emotional cloudiness that can kind of sometimes pop up at certain times of the month, suddenly that parts and that there's like a sense of peace. There was, I feel like, another woman who expressed this idea that like there was something liberating about even like not being viewed as just a sexual object, that there comes a point in your life where you just get to be a person. We talk a lot of times about, the covers of books and like judging a book by its cover, and on all copies of All Fours. Cause we always talk about sometimes depending on where you live, you might have a different book cover, but I'm pretty sure it's universal. The cover of All Fours is it looks like a painting, and it's a cliff. It's a cliff with a sheer drop. And that's on purpose. This idea of the cliff, and is it a sheer drop, and is it unavoidable, and what does it mean for you in your life? And I appreciated that.
I'm so glad you brought up the title I'm so glad you brought up the cover because I was going to ask you about it and then I had forgotten I was going to ask you about it. And I was not a fan of the cover. I'll explain why, but now that you're talking about it, I'm a little bit of a convert. I loved the font. I loved how like boho the font was and even sort of the color. But for me, this image was so pastoral or something, which was not what this book was at all to me. So I was kind of like thrown off by that. And the only sort of like redemption that I could give it, because I had not had that reading of it as like representing that graph or like that drop off, was like, it reminds me of something you'd see in a hotel room.
Oh, and there's a painting that she takes off the wall and puts under the bed in the motel room.
Yeah.
But one of the other, I think, notable things about the cover, not only is it a cliff with a sheer drop, but it's bright at the bottom. And so I do think that is meant to hopefully be encouraging. I have the page with the graph. It is great. And she is in like such a panic state when she's looking at the graph. And at the end of that like kind of section, she says, I expanded the graph with 2 fingers. The slight decline of the dotted testosterone line looked like a change one might hardly notice. While I was falling off the sheer face of a mountain, Harris would be ambling along a gently sloping country road with a piece of straw in the corner of his mouth, whistling.
I love that voice. So, Sarah, I would like to ask you, is All Fours by Miranda July a could read, a should read, or a must read?
I'm saying it. I believe that All Fours is a must read, Melissa. And I understand if it's not for you, but it is for me.
It is the first book of 2025 and it's getting a must read. I love it. I could tell even as you were reading it that it meant a lot to you. Like you were really excited about it. I think for me, it was a should read. Yeah. I didn't get into the must read category with it. I don't know if that's partly because I did have to kind of disassociate and go like, it's okay that I can't relate to this character and like her level of wealth and that position of privilege. But that's not to say that's a necessity for me when it comes to must reads. But it just didn't bring me into that sphere of thinking. But I did really like it. It was not a chore to read. I really enjoyed it. I reached for it. I wanted to know what was happening with it. And I just loved her writing too. Like such a skilled writer, such a beautiful, very distinct voice that I enjoyed. And I liked that she took a risk by just like writing about something that was unfamiliar to a lot of, or I shouldn't say it's unfamiliar, it's quite familiar to a lot of people, but that isn't really talked about in contemporary books as much as it should be. So I definitely give it a strong, solid should read. And I was glad to be part of the All Fours conversation because so many people are reading it and talking about it. And I'm so glad to be part in particular of this conversation about the book with you, my friend. Thank you for starting off this 2025 with me so strongly with a must read and entering into year 2 of this podcast together.
Wouldn't want to do it with anybody else, my friends.
Love it. Love it. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.